So, the new Canon R5 and R6 mirrorless cameras are now officially announced, and I have the R5 here in my hands to try out. We can't show footage unfortunately, as this is a very early sample unit, but there's still a lot to talk about. We're going to do a whole separate video on the R6, but in this video we're looking at the R5, the flagship mirrorless option, and an incredibly exciting move from Canon. So I'm sure you've all already seen the headline specs for the R5, but let's start by going over them anyway now that we know the full picture. This is a mirrorless camera with a full frame 45 megapixel CMOS sensor, but most excitingly of all are the video specs. I sincerely doubt there's anyone out there thinking that Canon didn't care about video with these cameras. They really have thrown the kitchen sink at the R5. We get 8K raw video, 4K 120 frames a second, internal sensor stabilization, dual card slots, one CF Express and one SD card, a new improved EVF, an improved dual pixel autofocus system that works in all video modes, including high frame rates. I mean, there's just so much going on here. This camera is without a doubt Canon flexing their muscles and going out of their way to re-establish themselves as a technology leader in this market. So let's take a look at each of those new areas. The body itself is instantly familiar for Canon users. Interestingly, the touch bar from the EOS R is nowhere to be seen, and there's the return of the traditional joystick. There's a bunch of other nice new tweaks which we'll probably go into in more detail in future videos on. But for the most part, this feels like an EOS R to hold, but with more throwbacks to the 5D line, like the joystick and the rotating control dial, which make for a more ergonomic camera in my opinion. 8K recording is top billing here in all of Canon's marketing, and it's very impressive that a camera this size can record 8K at all. The options available are DCI and 16:9, 24p, 25p or 30p, and their RAW codec or MP4 ones, both IPB as the long-GOP codec or all-I as the intra-frame one. We now also get 4K proxies recorded simultaneously to the SD cards, which is very useful, especially for that 8K RAW. The full autofocus technology works in 8K, and from what we can tell, the images are really sharp and detailed. But we did find some overheating issues. Like I said earlier, this is an early pre-production model, so we reached out to Canon to ask what they thought the units that will actually ship will be like here, because we can't really trust what this one is doing. And they said they're confident for 20 minutes of recording in 8K RAW, which, considering the camera has a 30-minute record time limit overall, like normal on stills cameras, I don't think that's that bad. We have to remember 8K capture, whether it's raw or not, in a camera body like this, well, there's got to be a limit somewhere. Combine that with the big file sizes that come with 8K resolution, even in IPB, which is the smallest compression available, and it'll be interesting to see whether 8K is a mode that people will use for whole projects, or just dip into every now and again for a wide shot, for example. Let me know what you think in the comments of this video. I'd be very curious to hear how useful people think this is going to be for their work. One huge benefit of having 8K in a camera like this though, is being able to downsample down for great 4K. With the camera's regular 4K mode, it uses the full sensor, and we get DCI and UHD. No RAW in 4K at all, that's only in 8K. So we just get the all-I and IPB MP4 based codecs in frame rates of up to 60p. There are then two options. The first is a high frame rate mode, which goes up to 120p. You keep autofocus for this slow motion, but you lose audio recording, and it conforms it back to 25p to give you slow motion in camera rather than having to do it in post. Having 4K 120 frames a second is a huge flagship feature for this camera, and possibly the one that is going to be the most convincing reason, I think, for people to pick this up for themselves. full frame, 4K, 120 frames a second in a camera this small with full autofocus. I mean, it's going to be very useful for lots of different types of work. The second option is one called 4K HQ mode, which may seem confusing at first, and we don't have the full details of what's going on here under the hood technically. But this is essentially a different way of downsampling the full 8K resolution to 4K in a way that prioritizes quality. So you essentially get all of the limitations of 8K, like overheating and frame rate limits, but at 4K data rates. So it's a bit of a best of both worlds kind of situation. And the results are great. We can't show you images yet, like I said earlier, but we need to wait for a final production camera for that. But in our quick tests, this 4K HQ mode is fantastic quality and a big sharpness upgrade on the normal 4K mode. Not that there's anything wrong with the normal mode. We found that to be just as sharp as the EOS R was in 4K, but without the big crop. You get no noticeable artifact problems like aliasing either, which is nice. And 4K HQ is definitely not as sharp as actual 8K is, but it's not too far off. I really like this mode, and it'll be interesting to see whether people use this as a always-on type feature, or if it just becomes a nice midway point for some situations between normal 4K and full-blown 8K. Now let's talk about C-Log. We get C-Log 1 in camera in 10-bit 422. But Canon are doing a few things under the hood to make this happen which isn't obvious at first. Apart from the raw 8K mode, the camera is normally recording in 8-bit 420 in its normal gamma profiles, and both the IPB and All-I use H.264 compression. Enable the C-Log setting and all of that changes though. The camera doesn't really tell you this obviously, but is now using 10-bit 422 and using H.265 or HEVC compression. This means the C-Log mode will be very good quality and it will grade really nicely. But H.265 is still intensive for computers to play back. So unless you have a new, quite powerful computer, most people currently would transcode it before editing, or just use an external recorder like this Atomos Ninja 5 to record it as ProRes or DNx HD. The HDMI port is now a micro one unfortunately, so you should definitely use some sort of a cage and cable clamp system if you're going to record externally. But you will get 4K full frame 10-bit 422 in C-Log 1, which will be great files to work with in post. And you can enable 4K HQ mode as well for even better downsampling. That mode affects the HDMI output just as much as the internal recording. So let's move on to the areas that aren't the recording formats, because the R5 is a very practical camera to use indeed. Canon's autofocus system has seen some improvements here. They're even calling it dual pixel AF2 in some marketing. We'll need to wait for a final camera to do some tests for ourselves to see if there's many differences in normal use and performance. But the big things that have been added are eye autofocus for video and animal tracking. Eye autofocus basically just makes face detect autofocus even more practical. When the camera sees a face, it will prioritize the eyes. And then when it loses that face, it starts tracking the whole head instead, even if you turn around and it's just the back of the head. This is just like we saw on the 1DX Mark III. This makes face detect so much more useful for situations like events where you have no control over your subject. Animal autofocus is also very interesting, perhaps more so for stills than for video, unless you happen to film a lot of animals. But you get eye tracking, face tracking, and body tracking, including of birds in flight, which if it works well, is very impressive indeed. Of all of these new features though, the one I'm perhaps most pleased to see is I.B.I.S. Having built-in image stabilization is just so useful when you're using this as a small B-roll camera for video work. And from the looks of it, it's good I.B.I.S as well. It's 5 stops of stabilization normally, even with manual lenses. And then if you pair it with the right lens with IS, you can get up to 8 stops. And that's very impressive. Pair this with the new 5.76 million dot EVF with 120 frames a second refresh rate, or the flip out LCD, and this becomes one of the best cameras on the market for fast, low profile handheld filming. There's just so much to talk about with this camera, and we haven't even been able to film properly with it yet, or even show you any footage. We will definitely be doing lots more videos on the R5, and of course the R6 as well, which is just as exciting. We've made an entirely separate video going over the R6, which we've released alongside this, so head over to that to see the details on that camera. But in the meantime, let me know what you think of the R5 in the comment section. Now we know the full details and have a realistic picture of what the camera will and won't be able to do. What do you think? Because I think it's a pretty impressive little camera. And to be honest, I think this is probably the best mirrorless camera I've used to date. If you want to order one for yourself, just head over to proav.co.uk with the link in the description below, or just talk to our sales team. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.